Lesson 3.2. Use parallel lines and transversals. Now we have another postulate here called the corresponding angles postulate. This postulate states that if two parallel lines are cut by a transversal, so we have two parallel lines here, P and Q, when they're cut by a transversal T, then the pairs of corresponding angles are congruent. This means, for example, the corresponding angle 2 and 6 are congruent to each other. Example 1. The measure of three of the numbered angles is 125 degrees. Identify the measure of the other angles. Explain your reasoning. So we need to find three angles that are all 125 degrees. So let's look at this angle here. This angle is 125 degrees. Then angle 7 must also equal to 125 degrees by the corresponding angles postulate. So let me write that down. And by the vertical angle, which we discussed in the previous lesson, vertical angle congruent theorem, measure angle 1 must also equal to 125 degrees. So this makes measure angle 5 also 125 degrees. So let me first write down measure angle 7 being 125 degrees because of the corresponding angles postulate. But for measure angle 5, which equals 125 degrees, we have two reasons. It could be a corresponding angle to 1, and this could be the reason because by the corresponding angles postulate, the corresponding angles are congruent. And it can also be the vertical angles congruent theorem. You can also use that reason because measure angle 5 is also a vertical angle to measure angle 7. The alternate interior angles theorem. If two parallel lines are cut by a transversal, again, two parallel lines cut by a transversal, then the pairs of the alternate interior angles, so for example angle 4 and angle 5, are also incongruent. Okay, and then we'll prove this later. And the alternate exterior angles theorem, if two parallel lines are cut by a transversal, then the pairs of alternate exterior angles are also congruent. So for example, angle 1 and angle 8, they're congruent to each other. And then we have the consecutive interior angles theorem. So if two parallel lines are cut by a transversal, then the pairs of consecutive interior angles, for example angle 3 and angle 5, are supplementary. So we can write measure angle 3 plus measure angle 5 will equal to 180 degrees. Example 2, find the value of x. Well, this degree here, 3x minus 7, is a vertical angle to this angle, so this must be 3x minus 7 as well. So then these two angles are considered consecutive interior angles. So I can use this above theorem here and set 3x minus 7 plus x plus 5 and set it equal to 180 degrees, and I can solve this. So 4x minus 2 equals 180, and then 4x equals 182, x equals 45.5. So this only asks you to find the value of x, okay? But sometimes the problem may ask you to find these two angles or any of these angles formed by the two parallel lines and the transversal. Example 3 asks you to prove the alternate interior angles theorem. So let's look at what you're given. So you're given P is parallel to Q. So I could write that as my first statement. P is parallel to Q, given. Now, since P is parallel to Q, then I know that angle 1 will be congruent to angle 3 by the corresponding angles postulate. And I also know that angle 3 is congruent to angle 2 by the vertical angle congruent theorem. So you can write just vertical angle congruent theorem. And by the transitive property, if angle 1 is congruent to angle 3 is congruent to angle 2, then angle 1 must be congruent to angle 2. So I can write transitive property of congruence. Example 4. Prove that if two parallel lines are cut by a transversal, then the exterior angles on the same side of the transversal are congruent. So we want to prove that angle 3 and angle 2 are supplementary. It's always a good idea to first analyze the picture that's given to you and then decide what to do. So here we want to set P is parallel to Q as your first step. So that's given. And since angle 1 and angle 3 are linear pairs, I can say measure angle 1 plus measure angle 3 is equal to 180 degrees by the linear pair postulate. And then I also know that angle 1 is congruent to angle 2 by the corresponding angles postulate. Now I cannot just substitute angle 2 in for angle 1 because there's a degree involved. So I have to rewrite this as measure angle 1 is equal to measure angle 2, and the reason will be the definition of congruency. You could just use a symbol. And now I'm ready to substitute in measure angle 1 from step 2 for measure angle 2. Because my goal is to find a way to prove that measure angle 2 and measure angle 3 are supplementary. So now, after substituting, I prove that these two angles is equal to 180 degrees. So my reason is going to be substitution. Therefore, I can state that angle 2 and angle 3 are supplementary. So definition of supplementary angles. A taxiway is being constructed that intersects two parallel runways at an airport. You know that measure angle 2 is 98 degrees. What is measure angle 1? How do you know? Now let's write a paragraph proof. A simple one. Angle 1 and angle 2 are alternate interior angles. So by the alternate interior angles theorem, angle 1 will be congruent to angle 2. So by the definition of congruence, measure angle 1 would equal to measure angle 2, which equals 98 degrees. Well, now this is just the icing on the cake. Later on, you will be asked to write paragraph proofs that are much more complicated than this. Okay, we'll continue the lesson in class.